Dominic never thought of himself as a jealous husband. He trusted Juliana. They had built a life together, raised their children with love, and shared the kind of history that made betrayal feel impossible until now. It started with a single notification, a soft chime from her phone while she was in the shower. He hadn't been snooping, he wasn't that kind of man. But when he glanced at the screen, expecting a reminder or a casual message from a friend, his stomach lurched. Ryan, you know you can't ignore me forever. Last night proved that. Dominic's fingers tightened around the device. The words blurred as his pulse pounded in his ears. He swallowed, his mind racing. Ignore him? Last night? What the hell was going on? His hands moved before his brain could stop them, unlocking her phone with the passcode he hadn't used in years. What he found made his blood run cold. Months of messages, teasing words, hidden rendezvous that weren't quite physical but were just as damning. His wife, his Juliana, had been keeping secrets. A sickening realization settled in his gut. This wasn't the moment their marriage broke. That had happened long before he picked up her phone. Dominic couldn't remember the last time he and Juliana had truly seen each other. Not in the passing glances across the dinner table, not in the rushed goodnights before exhaustion pulled them under, and certainly not in the way she used to look at him like he was her favorite story, one she could never get tired of reading. Lately, their marriage felt like a well-worn routine, a script they followed without thinking. He would wake up early, leave for work, and return to find her already settled into her own world, her books, her phone, her silence. At first, he told himself it was normal. After years together, love didn't always burn the way it did in the beginning. It softened, steadied, became something deeper. But now, looking at her messages with Ryan, he saw the truth. She had been looking for something outside their marriage. Something she no longer found with him. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a sudden betrayal. Maybe it was the slow erosion of connection. The nights where they lay in bed but felt miles apart. He had ignored the signs, brushed off his own unease. But standing here now, phone in hand, there was no denying it anymore. Dominic had always believed that trust wasn't something you questioned, it was something you built. Something unshakable. He and Juliana had spent years constructing that foundation, brick by brick, through shared laughter, whispered confessions, and quiet moments that needed no words. But now, staring at the messages on her phone, he realized how fragile that foundation had become. The words between her and Ryan weren't just meaningless flirtations. They were breadcrumbs, leading him to the truth he had refused to see. You always know exactly what to say to make me smile. A single message, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. That used to be his role. The man who made her laugh. The person she turned to when she needed comfort. And yet, somewhere along the way, he had lost that part of her, or had she simply stopped letting him in? The thought made his stomach churn. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the realization that she had already left him in so many ways before this. She had just been waiting for him to notice. And now that he had, it was too late to turn back. The moment Dominic walked through the front door, he knew something was off. It wasn't the silence. Juliana was often quiet in the evenings, lost in her thoughts or scrolling through her phone, but tonight, the air between them felt heavier, like a storm was building just beyond the horizon, waiting to break. He set his keys on the counter, stealing a glance at her across the kitchen. She was seated at the table, staring down at her coffee mug, fingers wrapped around it like it was the only thing holding her together. Dom, we need to talk, she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of hesitation. His stomach twisted. He had spent the past few days convincing himself that he was imagining things, that the distance between them was just another rough patch. Nothing they hadn't faced before. But now, looking at her, he realized he had been lying to himself. He pulled out a chair across from her, bracing himself. All right, he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. What's going on? Juliana inhaled sharply, as if gathering the courage to say what was already hanging between them. And in that moment, Dominic knew whatever she was about to say would change everything. The words had barely left Juliana's lips before Dominic felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse pounding in his ears. She had been messaging Ryan. Ryan, the man he had never given a second thought to. The one she had always brushed off as just a coworker. But now, the weight of those messages, the meaning behind them, settled between them like a boulder that neither of them could move. Juliana kept talking, her voice laced with regret. But Dominic barely heard her. His mind was stuck on the simple truth: she had turned to someone else. Maybe it hadn't crossed a physical line, but emotionally, that was another story. He could almost see it: the late-night texts, the stolen glances, the moments where she had smiled at her phone while he sat across the room, unaware. "I never meant for it to become anything," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Dominic exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "But it did," he said, his voice hoarse. Juliana swallowed hard, nodding. And with that, the damage was done. A line had been crossed, and Dominic had no idea if they could ever go back. Dominic sat in the parked car outside their house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of everything pressed down on him: Juliana's betrayal, the doubt gnawing at his gut, the painful question of whether their marriage could be salvaged. He had spent days avoiding her, pretending everything was fine for the sake of Carter and Charlotte. But inside, he was unraveling. He couldn't unsee those messages, couldn't ignore the way she had let another man take a space in her heart that had once belonged only to him. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move. The house was dark except for the glow of the living room lamp. Inside, Juliana sat curled up on the couch, her eyes red and weary, as if she had spent hours waiting for him. When he closed the door behind him, she looked up, her gaze hesitant, searching. "I made an appointment," she said softly. Dominic frowned. "An appointment for what?" "For counseling, with Dr. Vivian." He stared at her, emotions warring inside him. He wanted to be angry, to push her away, but a small part of him, the part that still remembered the woman he fell in love with, wanted to try. Dominic sat stiffly on the couch in Dr. Vivian's office, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Across from him, Juliana sat with her hands clasped together, her fingers twisting in her lap. She looked fragile, like a woman holding onto the last thread of something she wasn't ready to lose. But Dominic wasn't sure if there was anything left to hold on to. Dr. Vivian, a composed woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, glanced between them. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Juliana inhaled shakily. "Because I made a mistake," she admitted, barely above a whisper, "and I want to fix what I broke." Dominic scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't just undo something like this." Dr. Vivian turned to him. "And you? Why did you agree to come?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Because I don't know if I can forgive her, but I need to find out." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with things unsaid. Juliana reached for him instinctively but stopped short, her fingers curling back into her palm. Dr. Vivian nodded slowly. "Then let's start there." For the first time, Dominic realized this wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about whether they had anything left worth saving. The weeks that followed were a slow, uneasy dance between what was broken and what might still be salvageable. Dominic and Juliana attended counseling religiously, their sessions peeling back layers of resentment, regret, and buried emotions. Some days, it felt like they were making progress. Juliana spoke more openly about the loneliness she had felt, the slow erosion of their connection. Dominic, in turn, admitted to the ways he had retreated into work, how he had failed to see her slipping away. But then there were nights when the anger resurfaced, raw and unfiltered, when he would catch himself staring at her and remembering the messages, the lies, the quiet betrayal she had let fester in the dark. One evening, after another tense session, they sat in the car outside their house, neither moving to go inside. The air between them was thick with words unsaid. "I know I don't deserve it," Juliana said finally, her voice fragile, barely audible, "but I'm still here, I'm still fighting." Dominic exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. He wanted to tell her that fighting wasn't always enough. But instead, he nodded, because for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure it wasn't. Dominic had spent weeks convincing himself that he was only going through the motions, that counseling was just a process, a means to find closure rather than a path back to Juliana. But something had shifted. It was in the way she looked at him now, not just with guilt, but with the raw desperation of someone who knew how much they had broken and still wanted to fix it. It was in the way she listened during their sessions. How she didn't flinch when he lashed out in frustration. How she accepted his anger without deflecting. It was in the small gestures, the coffee left on the counter every morning. The way she would wait up for him at night, even if they barely spoke. That night, as he lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, he realized that for the first time in weeks, the anger wasn't the loudest thing in his head. There was something else now, something quieter, more uncertain, a question he had been afraid to ask himself. Could they really come back from this? The thought scared him almost as much as losing her had, because if they could, it meant he had to try. The weight of everything they had been through still lingered, but for the first time, Dominic felt like they were standing on solid ground. Progress wasn't linear, some days were easier, filled with laughter and shared moments that felt almost normal. Other days, the past loomed like a storm cloud, dark and unforgiving, threatening to undo everything they had worked for. But Juliana didn't run from it. She faced the hard conversations, admitted the damage she had caused, and more importantly, she showed him, in every small way possible, that she wanted to rebuild. One evening, after putting Carter and Charlotte to bed, Dominic sat on the porch, watching the sky fade into deep shades of blue. Juliana stepped outside, hesitant, but hopeful. "Can I sit with you?" she asked softly. He nodded, and they sat in silence for a long moment before she spoke. "I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm grateful you're still here." Dominic exhaled, staring at the horizon. "I don't know what the future looks like for us," he admitted, "but I know I'm willing to find out." She reached for his hand, and for the first time in a long time, he let her hold it. Relationships are built on trust, communication, and effort, three things that, when neglected, can cause even the strongest bond to crumble. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to get caught up in work, responsibilities, and daily stress, leaving little time to nurture the connections that matter most. If you feel distance creeping into your relationship, address it before it becomes unfixable. Talk openly, listen without defensiveness, and make your partner feel seen. Love isn't just about grand gestures, it's about consistency. Choosing each other every day, and never taking the relationship for granted. If mistakes happen, healing takes time, but it's possible with honesty and effort.